Welcome back. All right, we're going to talk about San Jose today. That's right, we're jumping right back into the teams that missed the playoffs playlist, and we're on San Jose for today. So if you haven't checked out the other videos in the playlist, by all means do so. Because this, according to my count, is team number 9 that I have looked at out of 15. I guess I could do one on Seattle because they didn't make the playoffs this year, but when was the last time Seattle even won a game? So for San Jose, they're kind of caught in the middle, right? So you have a GM that said publicly, that there's no rebuild, there's no retool of any sort. He believes in the core. And you have guys like Erik Karlsson coming out and saying, yeah, no, I don't want to be part of a rebuild and we can make it work with what we have here. The problem is we're now into 2 straight seasons where things haven't gone San Jose's way. They didn't even make the play-in round last year, meaning they were one of the bottom 7 teams in the NHL. And this year, no playoffs for them again. A below 500 record again. And this year they didn't even have the injuries to fall back on. So there were some minor injuries, but they didn't deal with like major, massive, long, season-long injuries like some of the other teams in the NHL did. So they finished with a 21, 28, and 7 record, which is pretty accurate. And at times they looked like they might be able to pull themselves back into the hunt for a playoff spot. But every time they started to gain some ground, they would fall right back again. So it becomes very hard to really believe in a team when they're doing that. They scored 151 goals this year. They allowed 199. And it's not really news that San Jose needs to keep the puck out of their net more than they do. If you want to blame the goaltender, okay. If you want to blame the defense, also okay. I would say that this season it wasn't as much on Martin Jones as last season, but I understand why people aren't all that happy with Jones either. So we'll see what happens in the offseason. But Doug Wilson, if he's going to make this work, is probably going to have to make a change in that. And maybe that change will come from within. I'm thinking along the same lines of how Minnesota did it. Ironically, Minnesota sent Dubnyk to San Jose. But San Jose, they have some questions to answer here in the offseason as to whether or not they want to get back into this or embrace the rebuild. So we'll see what they do. Their power play, 14.1%, which is kind of anemic. You're not going to win very many games if your power play is not going, and your penalty kill is at 80.43%. So those numbers put together are 94.4%. That's not going to get you anywhere in terms of your special teams. And then when you're not scoring enough goals 5-on-5 either, you have yourself a major problem, which is where San Jose found themselves. Their top scorer this year, Evander Kane. So we went through the whole bankruptcy thing before the season started and discussions about him threatening to rip up his contract so that the creditors wouldn't get his money, which was posturing, but, posturing is all part of that process. And yet in 56 games, he has 22 goals, 27 assists for 49 points. Not too shabby. And he was pretty good this year, and I didn't feel like he took as many bad penalties as the year before. He will always take penalties. It's the way he plays the game. But it didn't feel like there were as many occasions where he took a bad penalty as last year. So I thought he overall played better. Underperforming big contract. I hate to do this because I think he had a decent second half. But yeah, Erik Karlsson, for the amount of money they're paying him and for the length of this contract, 52 games, 8 goals, 14 assists, 22 points, just isn't going to cut it. The 8 goals are pretty good. And he was starting to get the goal scoring going, especially in the second half of this past season. But I still have to say that his contract in general hasn't really lived up to the advanced billing when he signed it. So yeah, Karlsson I still have there as the underperforming big contract. And that's the biggest issue with San Jose to me is you've got Burns, you've got Karlsson on these big contracts. What's the plan surrounding that? Top goalie, I went with Jones because he played a lot. And the sample size of the 2 other goaltenders who finished out the season in San Jose is small. But he goes 15, 13, and 4, 896 save percentage, 3.28 goals against. I'd be very surprised if he's still the starting goaltender for the Sharks this coming fall. He is still signed to a contract. I don't know if that means buyout. I don't know if that means trade. I don't know if that means working out a deal with Seattle. I'm not sure how this works. But I'd be honestly quite surprised if Martin Jones is still the goaltender in San Jose because it feels like the team needs a change and he needs a change as well. I thought Jones played well at points this year, and I still think he played well at points this year, but his overall numbers, the 896 and 3.28 goals against, that's not gonna work in today's NHL. So if we look at the record over 10 game segments, they were 4-5-1 after their first 10. It didn't get going very well for them out of the gate. 8-10-2 after 20. After 30, they're 12-14-4, so they were 500 during that 10 game segment. 18-18-4 at 40 games. So this is where that hope starts to come in, right? Where you're like, okay, St. Louis doesn't look that great. Arizona, can they stay hot? Can they maybe San Jose can get in there? But then they submarined any hopes and plans and dreams here by being 20-25-5 after 50 games, and then 21-28-7 by the end of the season. So they went 3-10-3. 3-10-3 over their last 16 games to submarine their season completely. But then the question becomes, are they a 500 team that just had a bad run? Are they better than this record? And that's the question Doug Wilson's going to have to answer in the offseason, because I haven't heard anything about them replacing him as the general manager of the team. So he's sticking around as far as we can tell. And he's got some UFAs to deal with. Nobody major, though. Like Marcus Sorensen may move on to another team and may play very well. I like Sorensen. Patrick Marleau wants to come back. If he wants to come back, I would think league minimum, probably gets it done, and he returns to San Jose. And on the fourth line, he wasn't hurting them this year either. Curtis Gabriel may return next year. We'll see. But again, not a big raise if he comes back. Matt Nieto, same thing. Greg Patterson, same thing. So there's nobody major there, which, again, when we're talking about some of these long-term veteran contracts, that might be part of the problem too, right? So restricted free agents. How many raises are we looking at here? Well, Ryan Donato, stops and starts. That's been his whole career. Right from when he was in Boston, it's been stops and starts. And at times, he will tease you with the idea that he's a top six forward, and then the production just never quite gets there. Jeffrey Viel, who played, I thought, well enough and a bit of an enforcer role there. They'll keep him around. Noah Gregor, Rudolph Balcers, who had an amazing run in San Jose. Odds are they probably get a pretty decent contract with him. It won't be a long-term contract with Balcers, probably 2-year deal. I'll save $1 million each. Dylan Gambrell, it might be double that for Balcers. Dylan Gambrell's going to get paid. But again, he's not going to make a ton of money. Joseph Kozanosh. So Kozanosh is interesting in that they played him towards the end of the season, and he played pretty well. But again, it's a small sample size, so you don't want to overreact to that, right? But if he's the future for them in the net, may very well be, maybe it ends up being his net as soon as next season. Maybe it's time to pull the trigger on that. And then you've got Joachim Blichfeld as well, who I always want to say Blichfield. And other people have said it too. I've heard other announcers say Blichfield. I'm like, I'm not the only one that puts an eye in there when it's Blichfeld. So we'll see how much they get. The interesting thing is, so when I do these videos, I talk about key injuries. So I'm looking over San Jose's numbers, and I can't find anybody who was out for a long time. I find Hurdle missed 6 games. Logan Couture missed a few games. But in terms of a key injury that really hurt their chances, unless somebody played through a big injury, which Logan Couture may very well have done. He's one guy I look at and say, he'll play with one arm. But it's hard to find injuries, because last season, of course, San Jose fans could say, we had all these injuries, Couture being one of them. And so, when we're healthy next season, we should be fine. They were a pretty healthy roster this year. And it still ends up with them outside the playoffs. So, yeah, it's interesting. Now, they're 22 and under. So these are players who played on their roster this year who are 22 years of age or younger, of note. Mario Ferraro, excellent defenseman who definitely took a next step this year. John Leonard, who may have some offensive upside to his game once he, gets acclimated to the NHL. Sometimes it takes more than a year. Nikolai Knizhov. Knizhov, I don't see an offensive upside there with Knizhov, but he's a very good defenseman, and I think he's got definite top 4 potential there. And I mean, when they're a good team, he could still be in the top 4. Noah Gregor, Sasha Shimilevsky. Shimilevsky had again, decent cup of coffee. The one thing, though, is, and there's Joachim Blichfeld, Ivan Chekhovich, and Alexei Melnichuk. And Melnichuk also got a start there in net. So between Kozanosh, and Melnichuk, is that where they go with their goaltending tandem as soon as next year, or just one of those guys play and they bring somebody else in? I'll say they bring somebody else in. I don't think you go with 2 kids in net, right? So the one thing with their 22 and under crowd is there isn't really a superstar there. And that's the thing with San Jose, is they need that next generation of superstars. So look for this year's draft. I would think they'd be looking for a forward. If they can luck into getting Beniers, this is a spot where I think Beniers could help the most right now. Because San Jose, I think, needs that young, up-and-coming forward, 22 and younger, to really, help them get to that next stage. And this is where that whole rebuild, retool talk comes in, right? So, at least for now, they've stopped trading first-round draft picks, which is good. And, out of this year's draft, we'll see if they draft in the top 2, if they win the draft lottery, or where they draft. Should be interesting. So, how did they do against teams in their division? How did they do at home and on the road? At home, 11-13-4, and on the road, 10-15-3. So, they had an iffy record at both. Of course, to start their season, they played almost half of it, at least it felt like almost half of it, on the road before going home because of the restrictions and all that. So they couldn't play at home to start the season. So there was reasons too for San Jose. You can trace back to that and say, look, they had like a 14-game road trip, some ridiculous number road trip to start the season, and they never really recovered from that. Fair, but again, I still think this is a roster that could definitely use some work and some changes to be made. They were 4-3-1 against Anaheim. They were 3-4-1 against Arizona. Struggled against Colorado, went 2-5-1. Against LA, 6-2. So they like playing LA. Against Minnesota, they were 3-5. Against St. Louis, 3-3-2, which is a better record than you might expect against St. Louis. And against Vegas, that's where it gets one-sided. They were 0-6-2 against Vegas. And they're still in the same division with Vegas next year. So they play them less next year on a regular schedule. They'll play them likely 4 times. But still, they do struggle against the Vegas Golden Knights mostly. Just not in the playoffs a couple years ago. But that's a whole other topic of conversation. And since then, nothing has really gone San Jose's way. So I guess the question is, do they have the young players on this roster to help turn it around? Or do they need to embrace the rebuild? What are they going to do? Because again, we've already heard from veterans on this team. They're not really all that interested in a rebuild. But they might get forced into it. Let me know your thoughts. Hit like and subscribe. If you're browsing your way through, you just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.